How many of you have ever witnessed an employee being excluded, ridiculed, based on an impairment or some disability in the workplace? A few? Okay, a few of you have. And how many of you have ever had someone question why someone has a job? You know, they can't see very well or they can't speak very well. How did they get this job? Is it necessary for them to have this job? How can we get rid of it? If you haven't, it may happen at some point in time in your career. Recently, I witnessed this on the job where an employee, and I'll make this up, was clearing their throat, and they do this all the time. And you know, there were other employees talking about, why should this person have this job? They have Tourette syndrome or something. It was really, you know, very bad, and I was like, couldn't the gods shoot down a temporary ailment just so they can experience this for themselves, and then see how they feel when people are talking about why should they have a job? So we often fail to realize that various people have different ways of processing information, and they also have different ways of doing their processes. It basically depends on, you know, the tools that they have and the ways that they can process that information. In many cases, there are disabilities that we can't see. We can't see it with our physical eye, like things like ADA or depression. If someone's in a wheelchair, it's easy to spot that they have a disability, but oftentimes you can't spot it. But you know that something's wrong, and the best thing you can do in that situation when you notice that something is wrong is just ask the employee, is there something I can do to help you? What can I do to help you? There are many disabilities that we can't see. Statistics reveal that 1 in 5 people have a disability. So think about that for a moment. Maybe you have 30 people in your office. Maybe 4 of those people might have a disability that you aren't aware of. So sometimes we just need to take a breath and just ask, what can we do to help? The ADA defines a disability as a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more of major life activities. The term substantially limits does not mean that it has to severely restrict. It just means that it's important. That's one thing, the distinction to keep clear. And also, B, it says a record of having such an impairment. And that would just be knowledge of the impairment. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to come to you and say, in fact, they don't have to. That only needs to be divulged to HR. And the other thing, or being regarded as having such an impairment, which is very important because oftentimes you don't know, you just assume. And when you make assumptions, you make many mistakes. And if you make an assumption that someone has something that they don't have, and they feel that they're being discriminated against, it can rise up to a level of claim and possibly some sort of legal action being taken. So it's something people really need to be aware of. The ADA says that it's unlawful to discriminate against a qualified individual with a disability. And also in the final regulations, because they expanded the whole ADA to the ADAAA, it also says that includes situations where it's episodic, so just, you know, if there's certain episodes, and also if there's something in remission, say like it's a cancer and they've had cancer and maybe they're good for a year, but it's in remission, it's still considered a disability under the ADA. In addition, impairments such as bodily functions, so these include things like the working, walking, standing, also your skin, your brain, your bowels, your bladder. There are just a multitude of disabilities that and issues that are considered a disability. So, you know, sometimes people say, how can that be a disability? Well, you really don't know. Your best course of action, if you need to know, is consult HR. Employers covered under the ADA are private employers, state and local government, employment agencies, labor organizations, and labor management committees. It includes all employers with 25 or more employees after 1992 and 15 or more after 1994. The employment practices covered is not simply that you can just hire someone with a disability and say, I'm done. It includes recruitment, pay, hiring, firing, promotion, job assignments, training, leave, layoff, benefits, and a multitude of other employment-related activities. The individual must be qualified, and they need to be able to perform the essential functions of the job. Essential functions are the basic duties of the job. So a lot of times people think that they can just create a job description and say you need to be able to do this. Well, recently there's a case in the court, and it's the Sixth Circuit, which is what we should always pay attention to in Ohio, where the court decided, and the case is Gunter versus Bemis, and it was October 2018. And the court ruled that the job description is not enough. It doesn't make it an essential function of the job. Things that they look at are work experience of the present and past employees, work experience of other people in a similar job, time spent performing the function, and the consequences of the employee not performing that function. So you may say something's relevant, and the court says, I don't think so. So just be aware of that. Job descriptions are not always the qualifier here. Reasonable accommodation is any change or adjustment to a work where the employee permits an employee with a disability to perform the essential functions of a job. So accommodations, a lot of people think you have to create a major expense, and create a whole roadway or something like that so the employee can enter the building. When sometimes it's just modifying, like say an employee needs to not interact with people because they have a depressive state. So allow them not to interact and just work solo. There are all kinds of modifications that can be done. The only time an accommodation is not required is if it would create an undue hardship. And most of the time, these things don't cost anything. So people need to be aware of that as well. The other thing that I wanted to cover is that reasonable accommodations are usually asked for by the employee, and they can usually tell you what they need because they know what their issue is, and they've probably dealt with it most of their life. However, when there's nothing available, or they don't know, or no one knows, they have a job accommodation network you can always consult. You can consult HR. You can always look up or create various ways and try things as well to see if they'll work to make this accommodation happen. However, most of the time we don't really need to do this in order to make an accommodation. If there's an issue going on, most of the time it's very obvious. You can tell. It doesn't have to be out. Maybe somebody's crying at work, or there's some other tell. So all you really need to do is have a conversation with the employee and say, what can I do to help you? How can I help you? If there's something we can do to make work easier for you, just let us know. And this is coming from us as colleagues. It doesn't necessarily have to be the manager. Hopefully your manager is keen enough to know that their employees are having an issue. But sometimes we, as colleagues, spot it first, so we can do things to help when we see someone struggling. And finally, I don't know if everyone has had their training yet, but there's a harassment training that we're all required to take by December 31st or something like that. And in that, we're now obligated to, when we see these things, we have an obligation to report this. Most of the time, people don't want to get involved, they don't want to do anything, but they do have an anonymous reporting line that you can use and just try to help and reach out to do what you can to help the person, because it is all about respect. If you were in that situation, I'm sure you would want someone to help you, and most of the time, people don't know what to do in a situation, so pay attention to your training and to that anonymous phone line. Thank you.